Welcome to the Valley Politics History Interviews. I'm Terry Christensen. Phil Trounstine joined the San Jose Mercury News in 1978, just as the newspaper was transitioning to new management and more objective news coverage. He covered state and local politics for just over 20 years at a time when the Mercury News was a really good newspaper. His best-known efforts include big series on who the most powerful people in the city were in 1980 and again in 1990. The 1980 study resulted in Movers and Shakers, a book I co-authored with Phil. In 1999, he left reporting to become communications director for Governor Gray Davis, leaving the Davis administration before the recall election to become director of the San Jose State University Survey and Policy Research Institute. On retiring from that position, he launched calbuzz.com, a political news and analysis website. Sadly, Phil passed away in 2022, but fortunately we have our 2018 Valley Politics interview to remember him and his work. Here's Phil. Phil Trounstine, welcome to Valley Politics.
Well, it's nice to be here, Terry.
It's great to see you, and looking forward to this conversation. Let's start in 1978. You graduated from San Jose State. You went to Indianapolis for a couple of years, working at a major newspaper there. You come back to San Jose, 1978, and that's just after the Ritter family gave up control of the newspaper, and it became corporate Knight Ritter.
Right.
So it was virtually a new newspaper. What was it like as a young reporter coming onto a newspaper, changing?
Well, that's a great question, because when I left San Jose, the Mercury News was really kind of a trash newspaper. It wasn't covering the city, wasn't covering the state. It really was a lousy newspaper run by old Joe Ritter. And when the Knights took over, and then they brought in Larry Jinks, and Tony Ritter became the young publisher, it was a complete transformation. And suddenly Larry Jinks, who had a lot of money now from the Knight folks, started hiring young reporters from all over the country and basically saying, there's sacred cows out there, go out and shoot them, and we'll back you up. And so everything we did was new, because nobody had ever covered San Jose with any kind of real journalistic objectivity. Joe had been a real booster, and that was the model of publishers back at that time. And Jinks, as the editor, and Tony as the new publisher, were just changing everything. And so it was a wonderful time to be a young reporter at a paper that was just changing its whole image.
Big investment in reporting staff.
That's right.
Big change on the editorial page, from very conservative to moderate to liberal.
Right.
You were later part of the editorial page.
Later,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. And 78 was a really big year in San Jose politics. What a year to arrive.
Right. Well, see, Joe Ritter, in the old days, had referred, when there had been some movement to try to get district elections, they used to refer to them as wards.
Yeah.
They used the old Chicago term to sort of imply that it was a boss system, because Ritter didn't want them. As long as they had at-large elections, the newspaper had more power.
Yeah.
So when district elections came along, we started actually referring to them as districts as opposed to wards. That was a shift.
Yeah.
And then Ed Pope, who later became the city editor, and I did a huge series where we looked at each of the proposed districts, and we did a demographic profile of what they were in terms of their economy, in terms of their political leaning, and in terms of their racial makeup of what each of the districts would be. And we did a big supplement in the newspaper, a 10-page supplement with a look at all the new districts, and then a big discussion of the pros and cons of going to districts. You were big advocate for districts.
I chaired the campaign.
Right.
And as you well remember, we argued about your
We argued about it because you felt like, well, there's no legitimate opposition to this, and I kept trying to find somebody who would speak up and oppose districts, and there were a few people.
I was objecting to your balanced reporting.
My balanced report, exactly.
Shouldn't be balanced. There are more people on our side.
And it turned out that there there weren't a lot of people who wanted to
Yeah.
go on the record speaking against it, but there were a few. And I think the outcome was fairly close. Districts
It was
won.
close. It was close.
But it was a huge change because it meant that Willow Glen and East San Jose and downtown, Almaden Valley each had their own district council member, and that was a big deal difference. It also made the power of the mayor greater because now you
Yes,
had a
good
bigger
point.
city council
Yeah.
and one mayor who was elected citywide. And if that mayor was able to win in all those different districts, then that mayor had power in those districts
Yep.
that sometimes was greater than the council member.
Yep.
Right.
So that went in, the district election process went into effect in 1980, but I want to go back to 78 a little
Okay.
bit longer
All
because
right.
so much stuff was happening.
Right.
Also that year was the Fearsome Foursome, or
That's
the Gang of Four.
Right.
You were covering that?
I did. You had Larry Pegram, Joe Cola, Al Garza, and David Runyon.
Yeah.
And
Four
they-
members of a seven-member city
seven-member
council.
city council. The four members, they took over power and they fired the city manager, Ted Tedesco.
Yeah.
And why did they fire the city manager? Well, because Ted Tedesco was the first controlled growth city manager San Jose had ever seen. Up until that point, you had the era of Dutch Hammond and these other city managers who pretty much felt like if it's there, we'll build on top of it and expand. They even referred to Dutch Hammond's expansion movement as Dutch's Panzer Division.
Yeah, like the German tanks
The
rolling
German
across
tank,
Europe.
right.
Yeah.
And so they fired Ted Tedesco, the four members of the city council, and Janet Gray Hayes was the mayor, but she couldn't get a majority of the city council. She only had three. It was only she and two others.
Yeah.
And so, but the foursome couldn't hold together. They were kind of a mess. One, Al Garza was later convicted of bribery.
Yep.
David Runyon was found drunk in a parked car downtown and had to resign. When he resigned, now you had a 3-3 vote on the city council, and they managed to appoint, to fill out his term, this young planning commissioner with longtime roots in the community, Tom McHenry.
Tom McHenry.
And so now you had a 4-3 split on the city council in favor of controlled growth. Tedesco's gone, but they've got Gary Schoenauer over in the planning department. They've got some big changes are happening. And so suddenly the civic religion of San Jose became controlled growth. And the notion was basically that let's not outstrip our natural resources. Let's grow that in a way that's economically important for the city to do, but let's do it in a way that makes sense. Let's not outstrip our ability to provide police and fire service, and let's not pave over the hillsides. Let's have controlled growth.
And interestingly, some of the tenets of that civic religion are being challenged today because we have such a dire housing shortage.
Right.
But nobody's saying go back to the sprawling growth that we had in the 50s and 60s into the 70s.
Well, you also don't have anybody covering it probably with any degree of.
It's best coverage on the business pages actually because it's about housing prices and turnover and
right.
so on.
But the real issue, I mean, I got to become the city hall reporter shortly thereafter, and what was fascinating was to actually follow the changes in zoning, the general plan changes, and then zoning changes. The battles over these things were always huge.
Yeah.
And
recurrent.
Right, and we always knew. And the issue really became sort of the folks who argued for infill, those who said, let's have 10, 12, 14, 18, 24 units built per acre, versus the guys who wanted to build 4 or 8 units per acre, which is cookie cutter. Anybody can go out and build housing on land, but to build concentrated stuff near transportation corridors, that was the big shift.
Yeah.
It's more challenging and it's a big shift. If you look at downtown housing, for example, that's hard to build. You got to build high rise, you got to put sprinklers in, you got to build underground parking. That's a lot harder than building, a tract house out in the suburbs.
Yeah. Now I'm going to get all the way up to 1980.
Okay.
All the way up to 1980, because that's a big year in your career. I think, and certainly in what the Mercury did, that's the year they let you go for 6 or 8 weeks on a single story studying the power structure of San Jose.
Right.
I suspect they were curious what it was because a lot of your executives at the Merc were new.
Right.
But tell us about the study.
Well, I had done a similar study when I was at the Indianapolis Star.
Indianapolis, yeah.
And what I did was I took the model that Floyd Hunter, famous sociologist,
And where did you learn about that
and I
model?
learned about that in Terry Christensen's urban politics class. And so Floyd Hunter had done this study of Atlanta in 1954, where he developed what he called the reputational model. And the idea was to find a group of people who are, because of their position, are well informed, and you go to them and you ask them, if a project were before the community that required a decision by a group of leaders, which 10 could put it over?
Mm-hmm.
And then these people would come up. And then you go to the people who emerge in that list, and you ask them which 3 could put it over. And it's all off the record, so everybody gets to, all these people get to be quite candid about what they think of the other people. And so I'm talking to David Packard, and he's telling me what he thinks of Janet Gray Hayes and Rod Dearden. And I'm talking, to Cliff Swenson, the builder, and he's telling me what he thinks of Phil Hammer or Conrad Rushing. And so all these different folks get asked these questions, and then eventually you develop a list of however many you decide. We did the top 10 as a first tier, and then we did 20 as a second tier. And then we did profiles of each of those people. And what it revealed was who, in terms of their reputation, were the people seen as the movers and shakers in the city of San Jose. And it's been tried in broader areas, but you really need a contained area that has a defined sphere of influence to look at. And so San Jose is a perfect model. And what we found was, as opposed to the old eastern cities, which had a lot of business people, there were, in fact, because it was a western city, more public officials that were involved. You still had David Packard, who didn't even live in San Jose, who was in the top 10. He's all the way up in Palo Alto. But the truth was, if David Packard and Janet Gray Hayes and Tony Ritter, who was the publisher of the Mercury News at the time, if the 3 of them decided they wanted to do something, it got done. Proof of that was when Tom McHenry and David Packard and Tony Ritter got together and decided to do something. That's how you got the Tech Museum of Innovation. That's how it happened. They stole it away from the Junior League of Palo Alto and put it in downtown San Jose.
And you replicated the study in 1990.
Right. Did it again. In that year, it was somewhat different. In that year, by then, the Mercury News had become so powerful. Tony Ritter was what Floyd Hunter used to call a star isolate. And he was in a category by himself. And there were still Larry Jenks, I think, of the Mercury News, and a couple other folks were important, but really the Mercury News' power was so great at that point that Ritter was by himself.
And I think also in the 1990 study you found more turnover in the top 10 and top 40 than you found in Indianapolis, for example. The older cities have more stable power structures. San Jose and other Sunbelt cities, more turnover.
More turnover. Well, there aren't the same old institutions.
And old families.
Yeah, and old families. I mean, I think San Francisco would be very different, for example, because there's some really old families with a lot of money who go back for generations. San Jose doesn't have that. And in fact, some of the biggest businesses in San Jose, the people who run them don't live in San Jose. They don't really much care about San Jose. They live in Los Gatos or they live in Atherton.
And of course, in 1982, you and I made these studies, the first study, into a very famous book.
That's right.
Called Movers and Shakers, which you can still find used on Amazon.
That's right.
Right.
And it's still taught in some political science classes.
It's a classic.
It is a classic, actually, because what it does is it takes Hunter's model and shows how it's usable.
You really wrote a cookbook.
Yeah, a cookbook on how to do it.
Yeah. Well, What about other big stories you covered? Redevelopment, the McHenry election in '82?
Redevelopment was a big deal. I remember going to redevelopment meetings early on where they were just sort of beginning to plan what downtown should look like. And
Still working on it.
and they're still working on it. Well, but when McHenry came along and got appointed first and then elected to the city council, suddenly you had a genuine advocate for building up downtown on the city council. And the importance of that, particularly if you're interested in growth, is the notion was build up downtown and restrict growth on the exterior, out in the suburbs, so that you force this concentration of wealth and interest in the center city. And that helps control growth, it's more efficient, and it creates the possibility of a cultural mix in the center of town. McHenry actually believed in this. Now, his family owned property on San Pedro Square, and so some people thought that was a huge conflict of interest. You know, I don't think he ever did anything to directly benefit his own property. I don't think Tom was a double-dealing guy, but he really believed in downtown.
You went on to be Governor Gray Davis's communications director.
I did.
What was it like to change sides from
Well,
reporting
it was a challenge. As a communications director for Davis, I was in charge of 13 state agencies and 60 state departments, all their public affairs. And what I told, and I had a direct staff that was in charge of his press, his advance, his schedule, and all his speech writing. And so it was a big job. What I told my people was, the best spin is true. That never lie to reporters.
What a concept.
Never lie to reporters, and you tell the truth. Obviously, your job in that situation is to try to put the best spin on what you do, on what your guy's doing. But really good public relations. And the Obama administration was good at this. Doesn't lie. They just tell the story the way they'd like it to be told.
Finally, quickly, what's going on with your blog, CalBuzz?
CalBuzz is still alive, but my partner Jerry Roberts, who was the former political editor at the Chronicle when I was political editor at the Mercury, he and I have basically taken a sabbatical. So occasionally we post.
So we can still follow you on CalBuzz at least.
You can still go to calbuzz.com, and from time to time we post something new.
Great. Phil Trounstine, thanks very much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
It was
Terry.
great. For other interviews with the leaders and activists who shaped the history of San Jose and Santa Clara County, look for the Valley Politics History Interviews on YouTube.